Welcome back to my in-depth video taking a close look at Grand Canyon Railway's number 4960. In part 1, we took a close look at the tender and the connections to the diesel locomotive helpers. We took a look at the cross-compound air pump and also our water supply systems. So now we're going to take a close look at the feed water heater system and also the lubrication system, and we're going to take a look in the cab. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Eric, and welcome to my channel. What's it about? Well, pretty much whatever I want. I've always been a photographer, and with this channel I have a new outlet to showcase those images I've collected over the years and are still collecting. My goal? To take things I'm interested in and share them with all of you. You might find yourself going to a place you've never heard of, or learning about something you never understood. So stick with me, and you never know what's coming up next. Now here in the front of the locomotive on the pilot deck is the hot water pump, which is part of the feed water heating system. Now the feed water heating system is an addition that we added here on this locomotive. I think it was around 2006, 2007, maybe 2008, somewhere right in that range. I can't remember the exact year. This is a Chinese copy of a Worthington SA feed water heating system. Worthington stopped making these many years ago, but they still were building copies of these in China up until the 1980s, and you can still find a few of these floating on shelves in warehouses or things that you can still acquire. So we bought 3 sets, one for $29, one for $49.60, and one spare, and cleaned them up and installed them on both of our steam locomotives. And the way this system works, you've got 3 basic components. You start with a cold water pump, which is on our locomotive is located underneath the cab on the engineer side of the cab. This is a turbine-driven pump powered by steam, which takes your cold water from the tender and sends it up to a header tank, which is at the top of the smoke box. And you can see this up here on the top of the smoke box. So the cold water goes into this tank. It's heated in the tank, both from heat from the smoke box and also some small amount of the exhaust steam from the cylinders goes up into this tank and mixes with the cold water in order to preheat the water in the tank. Now, as the steam goes into the tank and mixes with the cold water, it also creates an aeration effect. As you're bubbling the steam through the water, it causes the water to bubble a little bit, and so any dissolved oxygen that's in the water, and we have water that occurs in the environment is going to have dissolved oxygen in it. That's what the fish breathe in where the water is in the lakes, is oxygen that's dissolved in the water. They're not taking oxygen that's combined with the hydrogen molecules. It's dissolved oxygen bubbles. So what's the problem with having oxygen in our water? Well, oxygen and iron, especially in a moist environment, create rust and corrosion. So it's advantageous to get as much oxygen out of our water as we can before we put it into the boiler. The feed water heating system helps to take some of that oxygen out of the water, deaerate it, and it vents off that oxygen along with some of the steam out a vent out the top, and then also some of the condensate goes down and vents down towards the track by the cylinder cocks on the fireman's side. After the water goes into the header tank on top of the smoke box and it gets heated, there is a reciprocating pump on the pilot deck that's controlled by the fireman, and steam pushes against a piston on one side, which then pushes against a piston on the other side, which takes water from the feed water tank, which flows down to the pump by gravity, and then it gets compressed, pushed by this hot water pump and pushes the water through a delivery pipe into the boiler check, into the boiler. Now the boiler is at 200 pounds per square inch. There's a check valve that you have to overcome in order to push into a boiler, so it has to pump the water at somewhere above 200 pounds per square inch in order to overcome this check valve and put the water in the boiler. Now, how is all this controlled? This is controlled by the fireman with a valve in the cab. And what's going to happen is he's going to open up a valve, and the valve is going to send steam down to this hot water pump. That's going to cause the hot water pump to stroke, and the hot water pump is going to stroke back and forth and push water into the boiler from the tank. As the tank begins to lose water and the water level in the tank drops, there is a float valve in top of the tank, just like your float valve in the back of your toilet. And when the water level drops below a certain amount, it's going to tell the cold water pump to come on. The cold water pump is going to come on, it's going to spin up, and it's going to take cold water from the tender and put it back into the top of the tank until the float valve comes back up to the top again and fills the tank back up, and then the cold water pump will shut off. So the fireman can control how much water is going into the boiler by regulating the speed of the hot water pump. Several advantages in using the feed water pump system versus the injector. The injector is basically an on-off device. It's designed for a specific amount of water versus a specific amount of steam. So it's basically on-off. You turn it on, you put water in the boiler until you lower your pressure a little bit, you cool your water off a little bit in the boiler, you lose some pressure as you're putting cold water in, and then you shut it off until your pressure comes back up, and you open up the injector again, and you put water in until you reach the point that you want, and then you shut it off. The feed water pump, you can regulate the speed. So if you don't need a whole lot of water, you can put in a small amount of water. If the engine's working hard and you need water at a much faster rate, you can put water in at a faster rate. So the fact that you can adjust with a flick of the wrist by opening a valve, the amount of water flow going into the boiler is an advantage. Also, the fact that you're preheating your water with waste steam that otherwise would have been exhausted to atmosphere is an advantage. And the fact that you're de-aerating your water and taking the oxygen out is a third advantage. So the feed water heater is much more economical for the locomotive than the injector. So as we move around to the engineer side, let's talk a little bit more about lubrication. Here on the front, we've got a lubricator for steam oil. This lubricates the steam side of the pistons and the valves. The rods are lubricated with a soft grease. Now, you're probably familiar with a lot of steam locomotives that have a Alamite hard grease gun, where you have a pneumatic grease gun. Usually takes two guys to run the gun. One of them holds this big contraption up, and another one feeds in grease sticks in order to be able to grease the plane bearings on the rods. We got rid of ours many years ago, and we converted to a soft grease. So this is not that much different than greasing the chassis on your automobile. And back in the shop at Williams, we have an air-operated grease gun on a cart, and basically you roll it around the floor, around the locomotive, and connect it to an air hose, and then just grease the grease fittings. Up at the Canyon, we have a battery-operated grease gun. And again, it's not that much bigger than the one that you would use to grease your chassis on your automobile in the garage, and it's a lot easier to handle. We use a special grease formulated for high temperature operations, and it works pretty well for us. Now, this other lubricator here in the middle is another PB&J lubricator, and this is used to grease the plane bearings on the main driving boxes. So nothing on 4960 on the locomotive is roller bearing. The tender has roller bearing axles. It was converted 30 years ago, but the driving boxes, lead truck, trailing truck, are all plane bearings. So the driving truck boxes are greased with PB&J, biodegradable PB&J, and that's greased from this lubricator right here. So now that we've walked both sides of the steam locomotive on the outside, it's time to go up in the cab. So here's our firebox right there. There's our fire, and when you look through the hole, you can see the arch tubes which come from the sides of the firebox, from the side sheets, curve up to the crown sheet. And if you can look past that, you can see the tube sheet, the rear tube sheet, where the tubes extend through the boiler. And then there is your burner. So your oil flows by gravity from the tender to the burner, which is at the front of the firebox. The oil drizzles over a jet of steam. That's called the atomizer. The atomizer breaks the oil up into small particles and sprays it towards the rear of the firebox, where the flame will then curve around across the roof of the firebox, called the crown sheet, and the smoke will go into the tubes, which is at the front of the boiler. Backing out, looking at the rest of the cab. This is the fireman's controls. The brass handle here, that is the firing control. That controls the flow of oil to the burner. Other valves here, you've got your control for your atomizer, and then we've got various heaters for to preheat your oil and also heat your lubricators. Your gauge cluster right there, your boiler pressure gauge in the middle, atomizer pressure. This is blower pressure. That creates your draft when the engine's not working. That creates an artificial draft. We have a temperature gauge here. That's water temperature going into the boiler from your water pump. Superheat temperature. That will run up to about 600 degrees when the engine is working hard. Then we've got a gauge here when your water pump is working. That tells you your water pump is working. That gauge will cycle on and off when the cold water pump goes on and off. And then this one measures vacuum pressure in the smoke pump. All right, the two most important windows on the train, your water glasses. One here on the fireman's side and one on the engineer's side. These tell you the water level in the boiler. This badge plate here tells you the top of the crown sheet. That's the highest point of the firebox. You always have to keep your water level above the top of the crown sheet. So there we go. Here's our water level right there, several inches above the top of the crown sheet. Now, we're parked here on a downgrade. When the train is running, you're usually going to keep your water level in a much higher spot, especially if you're going uphill. Now, over here on the engineer's side, we have our controls on the engineer's side. You've got your throttle right here. And that's connected to a lever that runs through the boiler to the throttle valve, which is inside in the boiler in the steam dome. This is your reverser. Your reverser makes you go forwards and backwards, but also works like a manual transmission. So as you get moving, you need maximum power to get started. Once you get moving and you're only maintaining speed, you can bring it up closer to center, which is where we're at now in the center position. And that helps with efficiency, so you don't use as much steam in order to keep your momentum going. Then we have our air brake system. This is your automatic air brake and your independent air brake. The automatic air brake controls the brakes on the train and the locomotive. The independent is the locomotive by itself, or locomotives. So we have a steam and a diesel today. It controls both locomotives. Whistle cord right there. And I didn't mention on the other side, there is a bell cord for the firemen to ring the bell. We also have a pneumatic bell ringer, air-powered, that we can turn on and off right here. And we elect to use that because pulling that cord all day long gets kind of tiresome and becomes a hassle. This is your cylinder cocks. These are your sanders. So we have two directions, forwards and reverse. That will turn on sand onto the wheels for traction. And that's controlled by air. Over here is our MU box. This is custom made. So this controls the diesel locomotive. So up here is your throttle, or your reverser right here, forwards and reverse for the diesel, and your throttle, positions 1 through 8. Now you also can control your dynamic braking from here through this, and then this amp gauge, which is identical to the amp gauges you see in your EMD diesels, lets you know how many amps you're actually putting to the traction motors. Here we have our radio handset. and the radio right here in order to talk to the dispatcher or talk to the conductor. Headlight controls are 2 toggle switches right there. Speedometer. This is your back pressure gauge. If you want to learn more about back pressure and steam pressure, check out my videos on steam locomotive drafting systems. And of course, a boiler pressure gauge. You have 2 of them in the cab, one for the engineer, one for the fireman. Now, people walk in the cab and they look and go, oh my gosh, look at all these valves and all these controls. How do you know what they all do? Well, I've explained a lot of your gauges and stuff there. I explained your valves here, some of your valves here for the fireman controls. There's a few more. Up here, we've got some other valves, but these you treat as like circuit breakers. You turn them on at the beginning of the day and then you leave them on. This one controls steam to your injector. This one is for the water glass, so it's basically your top steam access to your water glass. This, on the engineer side, the valve is here, but on this one it's actually outside the cab, so it's controlled by a valve here that reaches out to your turret. This is your steam supply to your feed water pump, steam supply to your dynamo. This is steam supply to the firing manifold. All of this here is called the firing manifolds. So you have 2 valves to control that, one here, and then one down here supplies steam to all of these accessories right there. This is steam supply to your air pump, and this is an emergency power reverse. This locomotive is equipped with a pneumatic power reverse, so when you're using your reverser, you know, if you've heard of the term Johnson bar, in the old days with the steam engine, you would have a linkage here that was from the floor, probably 4 feet tall, 3-4 feet tall, way up here, that the engineer would have to throw all of his weight in order to be able to control the reverse gear of the locomotive. Well, we have a pneumatic assist, let's run off of air. That's why this is just a small little valve and it's fairly easy to move, small control. But in the case that you lose air pressure, we have this valve here, which will send steam to your power reverse to allow you to still be able to control your reverse linkage on the locomotive, because that could be a way that you could stop the locomotive. You basically throw the locomotive, the reverse gear in the reverse direction if you're moving forward, or basically the opposite direction of travel, and that creates a retarding force by compressing steam in your cylinders and will cause you to be able to slow and stop the train. Now back here on the tender is somebody's lunch, right there. And here we have sand, and what we use this sand for is when the engine is working hard, you scoop the sand out of there into the firebox, and the sand gets sucked through by the draft and scours the soot off the flues. And when the engine is working hard and you see lots of black smoke that kind of comes and goes, that's what their crew is doing. They're sanding the flues. We have a nice toolbox in here for supplies, and we also have a water level gauge right there. It's basically just a tube, but that lets us know how much water is in the tender. And then down here between the trash cans, there's our fuel cutoff. The one on the right is for the vegetable oil, which is the main tank. The one on the left says for auxiliary tank. That one is for a smaller tank of diesel fuel that we use to heat the engine up and get the fire going, and we burn diesel till we get everything warmed up, because the vegetable oil likes to be preheated in order to burn best. So we use steam to heat the oil, so if we don't have steam to heat the oil, it doesn't burn as well. So we use diesel fuel, which does not require to be preheated, to get things going, get things warmed up, get steam pressure, preheat our oil, and then we turn that on in order to get the vegetable oil, run the vegetable oil. And there's the temperature gauge under there. Reads about 120 degrees. That'll tell you what the temperature is of the vegetable oil. And we've also got something right here, because we're running 480 volt electricity from the cars through the head-end power. We have it stepped down to 110 volts AC, and we have a regular 110 volt outlet on the tender, which you could use if you needed to in order to run a coffee pot, microwave,
Now, realistically, we use that mostly when we're working on the engine back in the shop, and then we could use it to plug in lights, auxiliary lights for working or things like that. You could plug in a laptop on there. This MU box actually, has a computer in it, and so we can plug in a laptop and get real-time readings on the MU system to find out how it's working or how the diesel is performing. Now up on top of the tender, that is stored, that big box there, that's stored sand. So that sand, you fill the sand there, and then it flows down to here. There's enough sand in there to last us for pretty much an entire season. These valves here, those control your heaters for your fuel, for your tender. So those control the steam supply back there for your fuel. And very important, water, drinking water, and a water cooler, because man, in the summertime, it's hot and thirsty up here, and you drink a lot of water. Radio handset for the firemen. As I showed you, the radio handset for the engineers, so the firemen can speak to the dispatcher as well, or the conductor. And then also, very important, your emergency fuel cutoff. And we've got one on either side of the locomotive on the ground, plus one in the cab. That goes back to a cable, which goes back there on the tender, and that's a plunger. So when you pull on that cable, it pulls a pin out, that plunger drops, and it cuts off your fuel supply. And of course, when your fuel goes out, then your fire will go out.
Well, I'm afraid that concludes our in-depth tour on Grand Canyon Railway's 4960. I hope you guys all enjoyed this. And remember, you can always check the Grand Canyon Railway website for dates that 4960 is going to run. www.thetrain.com.